Thanks very much for your attention. And we need to get going quickly. We've lost a little bit of time. It's session 2, a new year, a new region, and new democracies. We've got 3 eminent speakers. They are 3 eminent academics and activists and writers and authors, bloggers and the like. You've got the names in your program, but in this order, Larbi Sadiki, who is over here, Tunisian author. He's at the University of Exeter in the UK. He's written a host of books and articles, and he appears on many TV programs, etc. He will be speaking first.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm really honored, actually, to come here for the 3rd time, to South Africa. Great place really to be talking about uprisings and revolutions. What I'm going to do is really a slight change, of content of my paper after I've heard everyone speak this morning and last night. And I thought really I will go actually for a deconstructionist take on the revolutions, the uprisings. Mostly really because I was impressed by what I've heard, but also I'm impressed by what I did not hear, last night and tonight. Things can be equally impressive, by what they say and they don't say. So I've got actually 4 or 5 themes, and I shall try as much as possible within the 20 minutes given to me, to address them one by one. And I think they're really important because, they frame the parameters, the contours, of a serious discussion, deconstruction, of what the revolutions entail or mean, etc., etc. Okay. The first one is a word that might sound like slightly bizarre to you, and that's actually the void. Al-Faragh. So really, if you are to trace the origins, of these revolutions and uprisings, you really have, to look at the faragh, the void. Because really, remember, the nature of the political beast, we have in the Middle East, is really different, from the kind of political problematic that you might find, within a Euro-American or Anglo-American, paradigm. All of us have been really fixated on the Weberian view of politics. And remember, the Weberian view is the state. The state is the space within which, political dispensation takes place. And we've had really a clash. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Ibn Khaldun, you see you've got a dialogue between Ibn Khaldun and Max Weber. Max Weber, the Weberian template, the state as we know it, the territorial state, the state that has got monopoly over the legitimate use of force, etc., etc. And this territorial Westphalian notion really resonates with all our understandings of statism, statehood, including democracy and democratization. Because, for instance, we expect the Palestinians, to be democratic and to engage in democratic politics without even having a territory, which is bizarre. Now, Ibn Khaldun has got, in my view, there's really a very good approximation of how to read politics, in the region. And for me, this is really a very good vista into, the deconstruction, of what's been unfolding, in the Middle East. For Ibn Khaldun, what we have, in my view, he's got actually a democratic model of how to understand, I guess, really democratic becoming, the unfolding of democratic ipseity, identity, etc., etc. In the sense that he, through asabiya, which is filial piety or tribal solidarity, whatever really you want to call it, he basically says, look, the center is occupied, by only one asabiya. Okay, and that is, the cracks, of the political system. But you've got actually rival asabis who will be waiting on the margins of the political system, for a new cycle, of competition, and then the asabiya that is endowed, with supremacy, what he calls jah or ghalaba, eventually, takes over. But he actually defines, a key precondition, for the access to power. That precondition is ethical, ethicism. And it's really important, actually, to stress, the role of ethics, akhlaq. So really, when we talk about revolutions, democracy, democratizations, we are really sort of, talking about ethical projects. And this is really important. Okay, so really, in a way, you can really sort of like, I'm teasing you into thinking about, I guess, really the non-institutional, the non-structural, elements, that make revolutions. Okay, revolutions are, I mean, of course, you can talk about the performative acts, the uprisings, the protests in the Maidan, etc. But there is like another element, which is, sort of, which is really good to enrich, this textuality, of revolution and uprisings. So really, Al-Faragh, when we come to Al-Faragh, remember, like, sort of, Waddah and others were talking last night about, well, he was talking about the notion of anger. Remember, like, anger is not really a term that lends itself, to political translation. In politics, we don't really have anger. We've got maybe disillusionment or marginalization, etc., etc. So really, Al-Faragh, in my view, is really the first, space where really you go and trace the origins, of revolution or uprising, in the Arab world. Because remember, sort of lots of us, have invoked like the term history. Yes, to narrativize and historicize revolution, we've got really, to stress, the long-term span, the longue durée. That is really important because revolutions, sort of have got like a cumulative effect. They did not really begin in January 2011. Okay, I now sort of Waddah talked about 100 years. I will actually stretch, the time span and say, look, 150 years. And really, basically the category I've got in mind is another, the Nahda time, what Albert Hourani calls the age of liberal thought, 150 years ago, when the first stirrings, democratic stirrings, began in Tunisia and in Egypt. And that's really why it's no coincidence why the revolutions, began in these places and were consolidated, etc., etc. There is like, this project, this delayed project, that has never been completed, and I guess really, you've got to look at the moral content and substance, of these revolutions, by tracing, this time span, the Nahdawi, time span. It is really important. This moment, in history is really something that we can, I guess, really build, some kind of thesis around, to be able to understand, this, the onset of these revolutions. So really, when we come to Al-Faragh, I want really, to invoke here, of course, like, Anderson, the imagining of community. And what's been really happening in the Arab world, especially like, the post-colonial state, the post-colonial order. Remember, like Anderson, when he talks about imagining community, he says, look, there's like, three systemic processes which accompanied the structuring, of any imagining of community. One of them is, de-divinization. Basically the order, becomes desacralized. So really, it's almost like, the Nietzschean notion of the death of God. That's it. And really, what's been happening, you can really say that there has been a challenge, from within Arabo-Islamic societies, to this, the desacralization, of, the process of building the state and building, community. So you've got like, if you notice, sort of across the board, let's say like, I'm talking here like, the Arab geography at least. You've got like, this diaglossia, sort of the Anglophile, the Arabophile, the Francisan, the Arabisant, because like, the project, sort of the workshop of state building, nation building has never been really settled, sort of, to the satisfaction, of a single party or a single, I guess, really discourse, in that part of the world. So this desacralization, the return really of religion, with vengeance, into the Middle East. And there is really a reason for that. Of course, like, you can talk about, like, the quarrel between modernity and tradition. Remember, Daniel Lerner, the passing of tradition, tradition is supposedly like going to wither away and modernization takes over, as Garth, mentioned, this morning. But suddenly, what we had like, modernity, leading to the reification of tradition, the return, of tradition. Okay, you can say like the turn or the traditional turn. The other one is, he says, Anderson, the detribalization. Basically, primordialism disappears, vanishes, and the state, that's how the state basically becomes rationalized, aqlanatu dawla. And this is really a very important, process. But really what we've been seeing, in the lead up, to the Arab Revolution is the reversal also, of that dynamic. So suddenly we ended up, with the return of the tribe, the return of, of dynasties, and the return of family, So it's almost like, a quasi-privatization of the political project. And that privatization is really at the core, of what happened, across, let's say, like, the Arab Spring geography, because it's not really a coincidence that the places where you've got a complete, at least for now, revolutionary project are Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt, and all of them have got like the big D, D, capital D, for dynasticism. It's really important, like, to invoke this anyhow, sort of, when trying, to deconstruct this. And the other one, of course, Anderson tells us it's, the nationalist, project, nationalization. So really here, sort of, you can say even denationalization, sort of, nationalism has become suspect, has become really sus. And if you look at the discourses, if you engage, in some kind, of content analysis, of the discourses prior to, the eruption of these revolutions, you will find, that there is really sort of, this, this criticism, this recurring, critique, of the brand of state, we ended up with, in the Middle East. So I guess really, al-Faragh, then, what is al-Faragh? Is basically the retreat of the state. The state retreats, and society basically tries, to fill in, the void. So it's almost like, remember, like under the Anglo-American paradigm, politics is built, by way of making power, in the Middle East or the Arab Middle East, at least, sort of, you can say politics is by way of unmaking power. And that's really what happened, in the Middle East. You can unmake power, but really sort of how do you reconstruct, democracy? How do you reconstruct community, et cetera, sort of is, I guess, really another thing. And al-Faragh, the void, for me, really captures the essence, of revolution, because you begin with a clean slate, There is like a faragh, it's moral faragh, institutional faragh, political faragh. This void, is really important, when trying, to frame, or to design, how to go about, democracy and democratization. Of course, we have not here, and I guess really I share, the concerns raised by some of you about the definition of democracy. But I guess really, minimalist definition would do, the representation of difference. Any kind of difference, ought to be represented. And how does that translate institutionally? That's like, I guess really very challenging, for all of us. The other, I guess, really theme that we ought, to consider is, the idealism. There's like so much idealism built, into democratic reconstruction. We always really begin like, with, I guess, really, you've heard that, like, in the paper, of Professor Shihabi about, what are, the ingredients, that make a democratic order. Is it majoritarianism? Is it, the rights, accorded to minorities? You saw, like, from the floor questions about, Christians, et cetera, If it is citizenship, it wouldn't really then matter, maybe, and I'm really provoking you really sort of into thinking about this. If we say, look, democracy really ultimately is a community where citizens, share, a platform by virtue of being accorded, the same, equality of difference, of having their difference represented, then really, I guess really, do we need, you know, to engage in discussions of the private, you know, public, you know, sort of the Christian, Muslim, the Sunni, Shiite. Remember, like all of these polarities, oppositions, dichotomies, you know, they're really, you know, sort of, they have become really part and parcel of this cacophonous, you know, debate of, you know, Arab revolutions and Arab democracies, et cetera, et cetera. So I think really, definitely, there is like really this need, you know, for rigorous usage, you know, of language and maybe reinvention of language. Because I hear also when we say like democracy, as if like, you know, there's like this teleology, you know, it's a teleological trajectory, definitely, when you have a revolution and you unhinge an existing dictatorial, you know, order, then like, you know, the destination is like one destination. It is, you know, democracy. Maybe it's not really democracy. State-society relations. I mean, so remember, like, you know, when you talk society, really, you don't really have like a single paradigm of society, because in Arabo-Islamic communities or, you know, sort of orders, people talk about community. You know, so remember, like, the non-territorial, the non-institutional, the non-structural is really important. And I guess really this goes to the nitty-gritty of what kind of epistemology, you know, we have. You know, sort of what kind of epistemology we're working with. So really, if your epistemology is positivist, is, you know, if your epistemology really more or less like mimics, you know, the kind, you know, of, you know, intellectual artifacts that people utilize, you know, to understand, you know, the world we live in, you know, the human condition, the democratic condition or non-democratic condition, then, you know, sort of that is like, you know, very, 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 you know, problematic. Remember, like, you know, sort of, you know, Professor Yossi, when he was talking, you know, his question, you know, to Shihabi, but he said, look, there is the street, you know, he didn't say public opinion, because remember, like the street, you know, sort of, it's almost like the Hellenic mob, you know, culture, you know, sort of, you know, the street is not like really institutionalized into something that is orderly, democratic, rational, you know, it's, of course, you know, Asif Bayat wrote like a brilliant book about this, you know, when he was, you know, talking about the unfolding, you know, of democracy and democratization, you know, in Iran. But you've got really sort of this language is not like incidental. Why do we use, for instance, the street? You know, why isn't it, for instance, you know, al-mujtama' al-ahli? Because remember also, like, really, there is an element of primordialism that underpin, you know, the kind of, you know, ethics that people you want, you know, to function with, you know, in, you know, this new order. It's really important, like, you know, to utilize it. So we've got like, you know, epistemology, and we have to ask, what kind, you know, of knowledge, democratic knowledge, you know, we want actually, you know, to develop and reconstruct and construct, you know, sort of in, you know, the current, you know, context. You know, you cannot talk really about democracy without talking about, you know, whose knowledge of democracy are we really going, you know, to deploy, you know, for the purpose, you know, of democratic reconstruction? Is it the American brand, you know, pluralism, American pluralism? Is it like Westminster type, you know, democracy? Is it, I don't know, maybe the Southern, you know, African model, you know, and to an extent, probably it's closer, you know, to what we have in North Africa and Egypt, etc., than really, you know, something that is parachuted, you know, from elsewhere. Okay, epistemology has got, of course, you know, implications, you know, for methodology. What type of methodology? Okay, and this is really important because that's really when social scientists actually can really murder history and mutilate it and, you know, sort of elasticize, you know, the span, you know, it's short, it's long, etc., etc. So, like, you know, the longue durée is really important. So, really, I can tell you, actually, on paper, there has always been, you know, continuous discourse, you know, of democracy in the Arab world, because really, us, you know, social scientists, where we search for democracy also really matters. If you are like, you know, state-centric and obsessed with the state, you will never find democracy at all. But if you want, like, you know, to find democracy in shi'r, in poetry, you know, sort of, you know, in nathr, in philology, you know, sort of, you know, in other, you know, sort of books like the canons, the medieval canons, you know, you will find at least like, you know, commitment, you know, to an ethical project. Let's call it good governance, you know, good government. You know, it's not really something that we can say it is exclusively, you know, sort of, you know, Anglo-American. You know, remember, like, sort of everything, you know, all of us really are steeped, you know, into Anglo-American social science philosophy, like when Hegel, you know, makes, like, you know, that sweeping declaration, you know, all philosophy, you know, is Western, you know, which, you know, by implication, all democracy is Western. Well, really, sort of, we should actually today sit down and say, look, no, it's not. You know, sort of, because remember, like, you know, sort of lots of that heritage actually was transferred, you know, through, you know, sort of, you know, the Muslim mind, you know, Avicenna, Averroes, Ibn Hazm, all of those people, you know, have got like a role, you know, in this, you know, sort of in this, you know, coveted possession, you know, of the West, you know, democracy. 2 minutes, okay. So really, I think really epistemology and what kind really of I guess really methodology we engage in is really important. What is the text, you know, we utilize, you know, sort of how do we move from text, you know, to context? This is, I think, really very, very important because we've got lots of people today, you know, I talk about revolutions, Arab Spring, they go to the Maidan, you know, for the casual visit to say, oh, we've been to Tahrir Square, you know, sort of what I think somebody called like, you know, sort of, you know, the tourism of Egypt, you know, just of revolution. And they come back, you know, with books, you know, sort of written, you know, sort of in 2 months about, you know, Arab Spring. And probably all of you have read something about, you know, the Arab Spring, Arab revolutions, you know, really very like, you know, superficial. I think really if there is an Archimedean point is that we are really in the midst of something that needs actually excavation. It needs, you know, sort of in a way like a little bit of sobriety. It needs like patience, you know, for you to be able, you know, sort of, you know, to engage in some kind, you know, of intellectual labor that makes all of us really grasp, you know, firmly, you know, what are these revolutions and what are, you know, sort of, you know, this, you know, uprisings, etc., etc. I guess really, I will finish by saying I guess it's really early to pretend actually that we even know really what we are really talking about. It's almost like really sort of truly. I think it's really at this stage it's really better actually to ask good questions and develop lines of inquiry and investigation. You know, so that we know actually how to tackle you know the nature of the beast as far as uprisings are concerned. And really, you know, sort of this, you know, the descriptive stuff, what the Salafis do or don't, or, you know, sort of the minorities, majorities, the public, private, all of this dichotomy is really what they do. Of course, you know, they are interesting in the sense, you know, sort of they animate this debate, and all of us really are, you know, share this platform, you know, of how to understand something that affects all of us. But I think it's really early days, you know, sort of, you know, to grasp firmly, you know, something that will need rigorous, you know, deconstruction and maybe, you know, rereading of texts that we have ignored. You know, when I say text we have ignored, like Awdatul Wa'i, you know, sort of Tawfiq Hakim, you know, sort of Tawfiq al-Hakim, you know, sort of the text, you know, of Taha Hussein, the text, you know, in Tunisia, you know, Al-Tahrir wa Tanwir, you know, Tahir bin Ashur, it's really important. You know, the writings of Muhammad Ali, the founder of the labor movement, the first labor movement in the Arab world, because really sort of labor is really important, and that's like really missing as well. You know, sort of we have like 100 years of labor movement and trade unionism in Tunisia, and I think I'm glad someone actually asked that question from the floor today, raised it. But like the role of workers really, really important. And of course, like really women, I mean, I'm really one of those people, you know, trying to you know, put my money where my mouth is. And I conducted lots of interviews, you know, with women from Tunisia and the visibility, the ubiquity, you know, of women in these revolutions. So really, women are not really oppressed. They're not invisible at all. We make them sometimes, you know, sort of, because we ignore them, because we don't go there actually and, you know, talk to them and get like, you know, their narratives and their stories. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'll call on Juan Cole now, whose topic is the in revolt uprisings that will reshape the region and the world.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks so much to the Afro-Middle East Centre for inviting me to this important conference. It's wonderful to be here for the first time in South Africa, a country whose modern history has meant quite a lot, I think, to all of us progressives in the West. My charge here, I think, is to lay out some basic problematics and questions. As Larbi adverted to, it maybe is early for us to wed ourselves too strongly to any particular interpretation of what has happened. I mean, I think if we approached it as Dr. Lepere had suggested from the point of view of political economy, and one can ask, you know, has the class structure of these countries really changed very much? The answer would be no. And so we're not talking about a Marxist kind of revolution here. In the absence of a big change in social structure, can we even call them revolutions? It's a question that doesn't interest me. I studied some semiotics at one point, the study of meaning and signs. And the one thing I took away from it, because it's a very arcane discipline, semiotics, but the one thing I took away from it is that all signs are arbitrary. So if we decide to call what happened in the Middle East revolutions or, blue cheese or whatever we want to call it, it's an arbitrary assignation. So let's not start with a definition and impose it. Let's see what actually happened. You could say that in all of the 5 republics where there's been major trouble, you had a form established in the post-colonial period of state capitalism. It called itself socialism, but it deteriorated into state capitalism. And then, after it had deteriorated into state capitalism, it deteriorated once more into family cartels. And actually, the people who were benefiting from the state capitalism minded the rise of the family cartels because they hollowed it out and preyed on it and battened on it and benefited from it and excluded other state elites. Once you go to having family cartels who functioned to extract resources from the country for a very, very narrow elite. The US Embassy in Tunisia, and I love my State Department colleagues, but they're not necessarily progressives, wrote back to Washington in 2006 in horror, explaining that they thought that 50% of the economic elite of Tunisia was at that point related to the president. And I mentioned this when I was in Tunis to my Tunisian friends, and they said, well, if even the US Embassy thought that, imagine how bad it really was. While Egypt was not on the same order of nepotism, the crony elite and the friends of Mubarak and friends of Gamal Mubarak and so forth were given licenses, were given insider trading information, and Gamal is now actually on trial for insider trading, which made them into billionaires. They were given opportunities, these crony capitalists, to buy up state enterprises. It was one of the ways that neoliberalism and privatization had an impact on the state capitalist regimes of the Middle East, was that it created opportunities for insider trading, which then created a new class of billionaires tied almost patrimonially to the ruling families. And then plans were made to pass this system on to the next generation. So the sons of the presidents for life would become the presidents for life. So not only was it an extremely closed elite, very narrow, nepotistic, crony, but the message was being sent to the people that it was just going to go on like that for the rest of their lives and the lives of their children. This is why it was important what Wada Khanfar said last night, which was that this idea of passing on the rule to the next generation, given the narrow and vampiric character of the rule, was one of the things that was just unsupportable to the revolutionaries. Who made the upheavals? Well, if you've got such a narrow elite, almost everybody would be disadvantaged by it. And that's why these were mass movements. They were vast coalitions of dissatisfied people. We've seen, I think, in the discussion sessions and some of the comments, a desire to find one's favorite protagonist in these revolutionaries. Was it labor? Was it the left? Was it women? Well, the answer is all of the above. Even the generals joined in. Everybody except for the crony elite, because they were all being disadvantaged by it as it became clear that they couldn't survive that old regime. We can characterize the people who participated most vigorously First of all, these were youth revolutions. It was the 20-somethings that overthrew these regimes. They were the ones in the streets, they were the fighters, they were the demonstrators. It wasn't that people of an older generation were unimportant, but you could see it in the interviews on satellite television. When the older people were interviewed about what did they think about what's happening, they would say things like, oh, well, the Shabab, the young people, they're doing a good job. It was identified as the Shabab. And you know, in English, they were called various things, protesters or rebels, almost never revolutionaries, which is, I think, what they were. But the word, the phrase in Arabic was Shabab al-Thuwar. It was the revolutionary youth. And for some reason, our American press was allergic to actually translating the phrase that was used by most of the participants for what happened. Yes, the revolutionary youth were allied with blue-collar workers, especially in Egypt, where the textile workers at Helwan would actually call strikes on certain days so as to free labor to go and participate in the demonstrations. They were also, however, allied with office workers' unions. And the office workers were a major part of the Egyptian and the Tunisian revolutions. Remember that these are state capitalist regimes in which as much as 50% of the employment was by the state. And they were, over time, being, as the neoliberal, narrow family cartels were hollowing out the state employees were increasingly being poorly paid in arrears, and so they were a constituency for revolution. You'll be amused. One of the major office worker unions that played an important role in the Egyptian Revolution, the tax collector union. And the labor aristocracy of the office workers in Egypt was the Suez Canal employees. And the Suez Canal employees in early February went on strike. Then the rural workers joined in. Of course, the rural workers were very important in the beginnings of this event in December of 2010 in Tunisia. The rural workers element in the Egyptian Revolution has been almost completely ignored by most commentators, but I was following the Arabic press at the time, and you could see it. So in Upper Egypt, which is poorer than the Delta, and which has some advantages for peasant worker demonstrations in the sense that it's connected to Cairo and Alexandria by these nicely metalled trunk roads. But what the peasants would do would be to cut down the palm trees, set them on fire in the roads, and block them. And the big six-wheeler trucks that would carry trade back and forth from Aswan to Alexandria couldn't get off those roads. They would bog down. So the peasants held the nation's north-south truck trade hostage for January and February in Egypt. They would bring donkey carts and just put them in the road. This was their form of protest. But they joined in the rural areas as well. This was a trans-ideological movement. So the youth revolutionaries, the people who planned out the big central urban demonstrations in Tunis and Cairo and Alexandria, were mostly leftists. They typically didn't belong to a political party because the state, had either co-opted or destroyed the major left political parties in these countries. So these were the children of Nasserists and communists and socialists, and they had turned to networking rather than to a party vehicle. But they were the ones who came on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and in the neighborhoods, because the revolutionaries in Egypt impressed upon me that in Cairo you don't need Facebook so much. If you want to make a crowd, you stand on your balcony and say, hey, we're all getting together in Tahrir at 9 p.m. And if you shout on your balcony in Cairo, your neighbors will hear you. and then they shout, and they call it hutafat. The hutafat were an important kind of drumbeat that got people together. But the social media and the networking were also, I think, not completely unimportant, even though relatively small proportions of the population, say in Egypt, were on a thing like Twitter. Nevertheless, a few people in all of the towns were, up and down the Nile, and so there's a multiplier effect here with regard to getting out information. Muslim fundamentalists were part of the revolutions, not the leaders of the actual overthrow of these regimes. They benefited in being free to participate in parliamentary processes later on, but they were junior partners or were subsidiary. In each of the three North African countries, the left was much more important. And you see this in Libya in the aftermath. I was told that the steel workers in Misrata, for instance, played a very important role in defending the city from Gaddafi's tanks, and they used their technical knowledge of metallurgy and so forth in order to fight the army and to fight off the armor of Gaddafi. It was leftist youth who saw Gaddafi as having taken the state capitalist road, and who saw him as a lackey of the West, who spearheaded a lot of the initial demonstrations in places like Benghazi. And the West has this Islamophobia and this focus on whether radical Islam might take over and so forth. And that was the dog that largely hasn't barked in Libya. The hardline Al-Qaeda types that went off to fight in Iraq from Derna haven't emerged and taken over the country in the way that the West kept worrying they might. In fact, the Muslim fundamentalists generally haven't done well in post-independence Libyan politics. Libyans are relatively secular-minded and are a little bit suspicious of the totalizing character of some Islamic thought and don't want any more totalizing. The techniques they used were the flash mob, calling for large numbers of people to assemble in a particular place at a particular time, and doing it with the social media, including cell phone, SMS, and so forth. Worker strikes were important, and road blockages, as I said. And they were trying to pull down these narrow family cartels that had battened onto the state capitalist systems. And one of the things that they were doing with these demonstrations and strikes, which were daily affairs and which spread from city to city, was to blackmail what was left of the older state capitalist elite that hadn't maybe benefited so much from the family cartels, to blackmail them into joining in the overthrow of the central family. And so, you know, they were demanding that guy be gotten rid of, that the Ben Ali or Mubarak or Ali Abdullah Saleh or Gaddafi be gotten rid of. And if there's going to be trouble every day, you know, nobody's making any money anymore. And if you're in the military, you're worried about the social breakdown and the stability of the country. And you have to start asking yourself, well, how much do I really like that guy? And the answer gradually was, well, no, not enough to kill people for him, not enough to stand in the way of his overthrow. And in some instances, they just, you know, put him on, as they did with Mubarak or Ben Ali, they put him on the plane or the helicopter and told him to leave. And so these young people actually co-opted major forces like the Tunisian and Egyptian militaries into helping them overthrow these cartel regimes. Well, a multi-class, multi-ideological movement that has its main demand, the removal of a linchpin, a removal of a logjam that was perceived to be blocking everybody else, can be very successful, and as we saw, it can happen very quickly if they all come together around this with their networking. But it raises big questions about the aftermath because they have nothing else in common. It's not that they shared a common vision of how to go forward. It was only that they wanted that guy gone. And they felt like if they could get rid of that family and their cronies, that it would open up opportunities for everybody else. This was widely agreed upon. So in the post-revolutionary period, there was a relatively, and I think this is a very key point, there was a relatively universal commitment to parliamentary elections, to the Schumpeterian process. I think most of them want more than just Schumpeter, which is regular elections and where the losers go home. That would be a big achievement in most of these countries because the losers, there haven't been any real losers and they haven't gone home. But that's, I think, the minimum of what they all want. And this is the big change, is that the young leftists in Tunis and Cairo have given up on the Leninist critique of bourgeois democracy. They now accept that parliamentary elections are good. And I think that a lot of the Arab world had been kind of latently Leninist. These state capitalist regimes were kind of deformations of a communist model. And one of the unstated assumptions of a lot of Arabs of the older generation had been that the parliament was a tool of the landlords and the imperialists and the bourgeoisie, that it would exploit the people, it would be manipulated by the rich. You know, if you let there be parliamentary elections, you'd end up with a corrupt capitalist regime like that of the United States. And that critique does not seem to appeal to the 20-somethings in the Arab world, whether they are leftists or whether they are Muslim fundamentalists. And the leftists have gone in the direction of Berlinguer and kind of the European New Left of the 70s. And the Muslim fundamentalists, who initially their movements had largely rejected popular sovereignty, because, you know, Khomeini was asked if they could make the Islamic Republic the Democratic Islamic Republic of Iran. And Khomeini intervened to stop that. He didn't want the word democracy in the title of the country. He said, if God says X and 37 million Iranians said Y, who would be right? That was the mentality of the old Islamist groups. And I think Hassan al-Banna would have said similar things, although at one point in the early 40s he was willing to have his people run for parliament. But this generation, Issam al-Arian, who unfortunately couldn't join us, and I were on Japanese television in a debate, and he made this point. And I interviewed Sheikh Ghannouchi in Tunisia. I said, Sheikh Ghannouchi, have you accepted popular sovereignty? He said, yes. He said, why should we be afraid of the will of the people? More especially since our people are Muslims. Well, I mean, if this is sincere, I think it is, but if it's sincere on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Nahda in Tunisia, that they accept popular sovereignty. I mean, I asked Issam, I said, you know, what if the people elect a Christian or a woman as president? Would the Muslim Brotherhood accept that? Well, first of all, he says he doesn't speak for the Muslim Brotherhood anymore. He speaks for the Freedom and Justice Party. And the Freedom and Justice Party will accept whatever the will of the people is. That's what he told me. So this is a big change, I would argue, on both the left and the religious right in the Arab world, that if you ask them what is their political model, they kind of want to be like France. And they think France would be a big improvement on what they've got. So I'm not making, I think there's going to be a lot of trouble about this because they're going to find out that being like France doesn't create jobs, and then, you know, capitalists buy the members of parliament, and those discoveries are yet in the future. But they want other things which might forestall, you know, the worst aspects of Western capitalist forms of government. The workers want the right to form unions at will without government permission, and the right to strike. Someone mentioned there have been 4,000 strikes in Egypt since 2004. They have a very lively labor movement. It was repressed by the state. The young people who are bloggers and on Twitter and so forth want an end to censorship. So there's a commitment to values which might help a parliamentary system function functionally. As you can tell, I think that the kind of pessimistic neoconservative view of these revolutions, that they resulted in an Islamic winter, is not only incorrect, because the Nahda only got 42% of seats in Tunisia. They didn't do well in Libya. They did very well in the first round of parliamentary elections in Egypt. But in the first round of the presidential elections that were just held in May, and I was in Egypt then, secular candidates got 2/3 of the votes. And even one of the Muslim fundamentalist candidates who did fairly well characterizes himself now as a liberal. I think that first parliamentary result in Egypt was a fluke. And we're beginning to see a new political geography in some of these countries. Labor is reviving, the left is reviving, people are learning how to form new parties, how to canvass. And so I think we're going to have a pluralistic set of systems going forward. I think that there was a set of log jams with the deterioration of the state capitalist regimes into crony cartels. And I think the people of the Arab world saw and analyzed that problem, and that they found ways now of going forward, and their future, whether it's positive or has negative aspects, at least is now open to them, whereas before it was closed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Juan. We now turn to Phyllis Bennis, who will deal with the issue of foreign intervention.
Thank you, Ronnie, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to AMEC for the invitation to come back to South Africa. It's always a thrill for me to be here. You know, for those of us who were young and so inspired by the anti-apartheid movement, even before the incredible days of the early 90s, seeing it in operation despite Marikana, despite the contradictions, is still an extraordinary thing. So I want to thank you for all of that. So I get to talk to the issue of intervention, who, why, and what does it mean? Somewhat of a hotspot in the question of the Arab uprisings. To do that, I want to sort of set the context a bit, both globally and in the region. In the world, we're looking at a reality that US power is diminishing. The US empire is on the decline in many ways. But it is not in decline in the context of military and strategic power, where it remains the unchallenged sole superpower in the world. The multipolar world that we hear about is emerging, but it is not there yet. And the US still, at that military level, stands above all the rest. That means, among other things, that there are still wars, there is still contention for power and resources, there is still the fight over influence and strategic reach and all of those things. And the Middle East, as a broad neighborhood, is still at the center of wars, occupations, the struggle for resources, particularly oil and gas, the strategic location of the Middle East. In all those ways, the Middle East remains very central to that global struggle for power that remains. The region right now is still very much in contention. There is enormous violence in Iraq after the years of sanctions, invasion, shock and awe, and occupation by the US. The impact of those years is far from over. There is an escalating, not a diminishing, an escalating war in Afghanistan. There is an expansion of the global war on terror, which, despite the rhetoric of the Obama administration, has changed only its name, not its essence. The only change they have made is that they have expanded it beyond where it was being waged under the Bush administration. We now have a drone war being fought not only in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but in Yemen and Somalia and the surrounding countries. So it should not be surprising, as we heard recently in the State Department briefing a couple of weeks ago, when the State Department spokeswoman, Victoria Nuland, in a discussion, she was talking about a new report that had just come out about Syria from Human Rights Watch, and she was commending the report and talking about how important it was. And she was asked, well, does that mean that the next time a Human Rights Watch report comes out on Israeli violations against the Palestinians, that you're also going to say, this is very important, I commend it to you, it should be taken seriously? And her answer was, and I quote, "We are not always consistent." Not exactly a surprise, but a little bit rare to admit that sort of thing. And her boss, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, actually just after that said something very similar, and she said, and I quote, "A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't make sense in such a diverse region at such a fluid time." So this is now the official policy of the United States. They don't quite use the term because they are diplomats after all, which I'm not, so I can call it what it is. Double standards and hypocrisy is the official policy of the United States in the Middle East, for anyone who wasn't so sure. That doesn't mean, and this is purely a sideline because I am not allowed even to talk about candidates and that sort of thing, but it doesn't mean that elections are not important and that whoever comes next couldn't be worse. They always can, and often are. But it means that we can't talk about interventions without looking at this broader context. And specifically, we need to look at how do we define these processes in which we are talking about intervention. The Arab uprising, the Arab Spring, call it what you will, is very much, I think, a regional reality that has its national particularities, but it is emerging in a region as a whole. All of these uprisings began in very similar ways, as a challenge to authoritarianism, to dictatorship, as a challenge to the political systems. Now, what they were not, as we've heard from a number of people already, they were not revolutions challenging neoliberalism, challenging the economic systems of these countries. They were challenging the political systems that govern those economic systems. In my view, the term that I find the most useful, and obviously this isn't a final product, is to speak of them as revolutionary processes. They are the beginnings of what may become revolutions, all-sided revolutions. They're not there yet, but they are certainly not simply small-scale uprisings either. What's important here in terms of what I want to focus on today is that in all of these revolutionary processes, they emerged against the domestic policies of these repressive dictatorships. They emerged from a cross-class coalition, cross-gender, cross-age, cross-every sector of society who were affected in all kinds of different ways. Certainly the economic issues, the role of the labor movement was crucial. The role of unorganized workers was crucial. But the demand that people had was about the lack of political space, the repression, the arrests, the torture, the lack of dignity, the concentration of power. And what that meant was they were not challenging the foreign policy or the international and regional positioning. So it meant that we see the same processes underway in countries that were largely dominated by and often tools of the United States, like Egypt, like Bahrain, like Tunisia, in countries that had been difficult challenges at times for the United States, but were still very much in the Western camp, like Yemen, like Libya in recent years, and in a state like Syria, which is a self-defined resistance government. I would challenge that, given the role of Syria, for example, in 1991, joining the US coalition and sending planes to attack Iraq, the role of the Syrian Mukhabarat and the Syrian government at the highest levels in accepting detainees from the United States to be interrogated and tortured in the so-called global war on terror. So the notion that this is somehow a consistent resistance government is, a little bit problematic, to say the least. But whatever it wasn't in the Western camp, and yet the processes, the emergence of an anti-dictatorship mobilization at the mass level was identical, virtually, to the origins of these movements in the other countries. And then we also can't talk about foreign intervention without talking about who were the original participants in these revolutionary movements. In every one of them, the origins were indigenous. These were populations within these countries, and these were mainly nonviolent, not necessarily as a moral commitment, but as a strategic recognition of what was going to work, and they were mass movements against dictatorships. Different combinations of forces in terms of gender, in terms of secular versus Islamic, and Islamist in many different iterations. And again, they were responding to domestic, not the foreign policy issues of their countries, the ways in which those governments were affecting their lives. Then, as they emerged, they were expanded. They were expanded both by the principled decisions of other folks to join those movements and by some very unprincipled opportunist forces, both exile forces within the government, foreign forces joining in for their own purposes, that had much more to do with issues of seeking power, seeking wealth, seeking opportunities of all sorts. And in some cases, those became more dominant, in other cases, less so. But they outgrew rather rapidly, in at least some of these countries, the original indigenous domestic movements that rose against dictatorship and against repression. So another way in which they changed was in the response to military assault by the regimes. Now, the regimes also differed in the level of military response, some by choice and some by necessity. In Egypt, the regime probably would have used significantly more military power if the military was prepared to implement it. The military split. In other situations, the military, such as we're seeing now so horrifically in Syria, the military, as was also true to more or less the same extent in Libya, was prepared to use much greater force, and the military was prepared to keep its relationship to the regime. I'm not going to go into all the reasons in terms of the nature of the relationship between the political and the military leadership, etc. But to suffice it to say that militarization, on some level, was taken up by the governments in trying to repress these movements. But the decision to take up arms in self-defense differed. And that's important because while it was clearly acting in self-defense in those movements that did take up arms, this was not necessarily an inevitable decision, an inevitable choice by those movements. If we look back in history, if we look at Vietnam, certainly there was a decision to move to the military stage of the anti-colonial struggle when it became clear that that was all that was going to be possible. In India, a different decision was made, despite massive repression, massive use of force, and yet a strategic decision was made to build a largely nonviolent movement. Here in South Africa, where you had, even after Sharpeville, the military component of the three-part strategy of the ANC always had the military component as the least important. That strategy privileged the mass mobilization at home and the building of a global movement in solidarity. Only in a very tertiary way, way behind, was the military side. It was really on the level of armed propaganda more than anything else, and played probably the less significant role in the ultimate victory against apartheid. It doesn't mean that these are going to follow this, that these revolutions are facing the same challenges that faced the ANC, that faced the leadership in Vietnam or in India or anywhere else. But it does go to the question of, is taking up arms in self-defense inevitable? And the answer is it's not. And one of the consequences for those who do it, and here it's a tricky question. We can't be in a position of making judgments about, do people facing military slaughter have the right to take up arms? Yes, they do. But does that mean that that decision is going to be the best way to win victories? Not necessarily. And there are consequences. One of the consequences, if we look again at history, is the loss or the threat to the mass character of these revolutionary processes. If we compare, for example, to keep in the Middle East region, the first and the second Palestinian Intifada. The first Intifada that shook Palestinian society as much or more than it shook the Israeli occupation in the occupied West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, was a nonviolent mobilization across social class, across generations, across gender. It engaged the entire society. And that's what threatened the legitimacy of Israel's occupation so dramatically. The second Intifada, that was characterized primarily by armed actions, some of which were legal under international law, some of which clearly were not, those that targeted civilians. But nonetheless, it was an uprising, a legitimate uprising against a continuing occupation. But it was no longer a mass mobilization. The mass character had been lost when it became an action primarily of small groups carrying out armed actions. And that had consequences as well, as we continue to see today. So that's all sort of the broad characters here. If we move to the question, and we don't have a lot of time, but I want to move to the question of Syria, where we are facing today the question of calls, certainly the reality of the armed decision by a large proportion of the resistance, of the opposition, but by far not all of it. There is still a nonviolent opposition in Syria. I asked for 5 instead of 2. Thank you. That we do need to talk about the specificity of Syria. And I want to say that the question of looking at the moment that we are in Syria is one in which the Syrian opposition's legitimate fight against a dictatorship is only one of at least 4 separate wars being waged in Syria. And it's not the one that foreign military intervention will want to support. So besides that war between the regime and the population, the democratic uprising that challenges the regime, we have a regional war of states fighting over resources, over power, over who's going to be the dominant set of state players, pitting largely Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and in a different way, Turkey, against Iran and Syria, and in a somewhat weird way, Iraq. That's one. Number 2, we have a sectarian war, largely a Sunni-Shia divide with subdivisions within both sides, again, pitting some of those same governments, but with a different tendency because there are other Islamist forces, non-state actors involved in that war as well. And then you have the global war, where the US and Russia, echoing the Cold War, are vying for control of resources, of pipelines, of whether the Russian base in Syria, in Tartus, is going to equal the US base in Bahrain. So that war is going on. Those 3 wars are far more likely to engender more foreign intervention than we see today, because there is already intervention today, let's be clear, on both sides. But more intervention will be involving themselves on those 3 wars and not on the legitimate war, if we need to use that term, of the Syrian people against a repressive dictatorship. That's the challenge that we face. Syrians who are asking for arms, who are asking for, and people are asking for many different things. There are different positions. Some are asking for weapons and we can do it ourselves. Some are saying we want a small no-fly zone in just a border region to protect civilians in that area. Some are asking for the entire country to be made a no-fly zone. Some are asking for direct foreign military engagement. The problem is, and we see it in Libya, if there is direct engagement from the main powers, particularly from the United States and its allies in Europe, there will be no control and no accountability to the people of Syria. They won't just leave when the Syrian people decide that they've had enough. In Libya, those forces, when they engaged in a full-scale air war against Libya, made their decision about what a no-fly zone meant, which was, we don't want to do that. We're going to engage in a full-scale war. When they were done, they packed up their planes and they left, leaving nothing behind but chaos, but the continuing militias that are still not accountable to the civilian government, thousands of people, as far as we know, we don't really have good information, that are still being held captive in some of these by some of these informal militias, etc. But the US and the NATO allies could leave without leaving anything behind. In Syria, that will not be the case. In Syria, because there is a functional, powerful anti-aircraft system, which was not the case in Libya, planes will be shot down, pilots will be killed or captured, special forces at least will be sent in to rescue them. That means boots on the ground. Call it what you will. They're probably going to be sneakers, not boots, because they'll probably be kind of sneaking around. But the point is, they will be functioning in ways that have no accountability to the people of Syria. Lastly, what do we do about it? This is a nightmarish scenario. The people of Syria are suffering at an enormous, almost incomprehensible level of death and destruction. The question is, what's going to make that better? I don't believe that sending more people with guns, almost all of them men with guns, or sending planes with bombs is going to improve the situation for the people of Syria. I think that as civil society, our job is to call for a renewed hearing of, privileging of the voices of people in Syria, including those from the original nonviolent movements who are still saying, no, we don't want more intervention. We want less militarization on all sides. For governments, step number one is to recognize that we can't always answer a military catastrophe that's being waged by sending more military. That's number one. Number two is it's not only what we don't do, it's what we do do. Right now, there are countries around the world, my country included, that are sending military aid in a number of ways, some of it overt, some of it covert. One of the things that could be done, and this is something South Africa could consider, is taking the lead on whether it's in the context of the United Nations, ideally, a recognition that more militarization is not the answer in Syria, and to stop all military support. That means arms shipments. That means for Russia to stop all military repair, replacement, anything. It means stopping all military support on both sides. Will that leave in place an even playing field? Of course it won't. But it's not going to make it better by further arming one side. That just leads to the inevitability of much longer civil wars. It doesn't need to anything remotely resembling democracy, justice, an end to dictatorship. If that's what we stand for, we have to figure out something different to call for. Thank you.